It started with a laugh. Not one of those casual chuckles you let out while scrolling through your phone, but something different, something too free, too young. Ik glinst her. She was sitting at the kitchen counter, leaning into her screen with a grin that reminded me of how she'd looked years ago when we were first dating. It caught me off guard. It's strange how marriage turns into this quiet, routine thing, and you stop noticing each other the same way. But there it was, that spark in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. And it wasn't for me. Sarah didn't notice me watching her. I don't even think she remembered I was in the room. I had been setting the table for dinner, a routine we'd perfected over a decade together. I'd cook while she finished up some emails. She'd usually pour the wine, crack a joke, ask me about my day. But tonight, she was somewhere else entirely, lost in whatever was on her screen. "Everything okay over there?" I asked, keeping my voice light. She looked up, startled, like I'd woken her from a dream. "What?" She blinked, laughed a little, and quickly locked her phone. "Oh yeah, just something funny." I knew better than to ask. Years of marriage teach you when to push and when to let things go. And maybe that was the first problem. I'd learned to let things go. The little sighs, the longer glances at her phone, the way she seemed distracted, distant, even when she was right beside me. But once you notice, it's like you can't stop. That laugh replayed in my head all night. While she washed dishes, while we watched a movie, while I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, with her beside me, scrolling on her phone again. A few days later, I caught a name, Tyler. It slipped out of her mouth like an accident, like she hadn't meant to let it see the light of day. She was talking about work, about some project, and then she laughed and said Tyler was just being such an idiot about it, and then she stopped. "Tyler?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She looked up, and for a split second, I saw guilt. The same look our daughter had when she tried to sneak chocolate before dinner. "Oh, just he's a new guy at work. Kind of young, actually. Fresh out of college." She shrugged it off, went back to typing an email on her phone. But she'd lost some of her ease, like she could feel my eyes on her, the way I was watching, just a little too closely. "He must be funny, huh?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She forced a smile. "Yeah, I guess he's a little funny." And that was it. Or at least that should have been it. But I felt something nagging at me. The little clues started to add up. The way she'd started dressing a bit differently. Not in a big way, just a touch more makeup, a new pair of heels that didn't quite seem like her usual style. The perfume she'd spritz on right before leaving for work. The way she'd light up whenever her phone buzzed. How she'd smile at it like it was a joke only she was in on. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that we all go through phases, that maybe she just needed something to lift her spirits, to feel young again. Lord knows I'd felt that way before, even thought about buying a motorcycle last year, until I realized I'd probably kill myself on it within a week. But as days turned into weeks, Tyler became the ghost that haunted our home. Every time she laughed, every time her phone buzzed and she turned away from me, I could feel it. Him. A name, a laugh, a text message. A whole world opening up right under my nose, and I was standing there, still wondering if I was even part of hers. I'd always thought the hardest part of marriage would be the big fights, the rough patches, the times we'd scream at each other, and then make up. But I was wrong. The hardest part is when the distance creeps in so slowly, you almost don't notice until it's already there, pulling you apart like two strangers standing across a room. And it all started with a laugh. I tried to ignore it, to shake off the feeling like it was just a bad dream, a trick of the mind. But once you hear a name like that, it sticks to everything. Tyler. It became a shadow, one that slipped between us at the dinner table, drifted into the background of our conversations, turned her laughter into a language I couldn't understand. A few days after she let his name slip, Sarah mentioned him again, just in passing, like she was testing the waters. We were sitting on the couch, scrolling through movie options, and she laughed, that same soft laugh that somehow stung like a slap. She was looking at her phone, and before she knew it, she muttered, "Oh, God, Tyler." I stared straight ahead, pretending to focus on the screen, my chest tight. But it wasn't just jealousy. It was something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A feeling that maybe I was losing her to something I couldn't compete with. I took a deep breath, wondering if I'd sound crazy if I asked her directly. "Sarah," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "You mentioned this Tyler a lot." She glanced up, surprised. Oh, really? She laughed it off, a little too casually. I mean, I don't know, he's funny, you know? He's this kid who thinks he knows everything about everything. Makes me laugh. Just a kid, I told myself. She said it herself, didn't she? Just a kid. But something didn't feel right. Sounds like he keeps you entertained, I said, trying to keep my tone as light as possible. Maybe I should start telling you jokes more often. She smiled, but it was an awkward smile, the kind people give when they feel cornered. Oh, stop, she said, nudging me. You know, it's nothing like that. But I didn't know. That was the problem. I thought back to when we first started dating, back when I was the one who made her laugh, who'd send her messages all day just to see her face light up. I knew what that kind of spark felt like. I knew it too well. After that, I started paying attention in ways I never had before. I watched the way she checked her phone more often, how she'd smile down at it like she was sharing a private moment with someone who wasn't me. She'd excuse herself to the other room, laughing in hushed tones. Sometimes I could catch pieces of what she was saying. No, stop, and I can't believe you. Like she was a teenager again, and I was just someone who lived in her house. One night, she came home late from work. It was just supposed to be a meeting that ran long. She'd texted, but she walked in with a flushed face and the same outfit she'd left in, a fitted dress I'd never seen before. She was practically glowing. How was the meeting? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Fine, she replied a little too quickly. It was just, work stuff. She leaned in to kiss me, but there was something different about the way she pulled back, as if she was distracted, half present. And in that second, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I waited until she went upstairs to change, then checked my own phone, scrolling through messages, emails, anything to distract me from the worried chewing in my stomach. And there, on social media, I found it, a photo of her, laughing with a group at some restaurant I didn't recognize, wine glasses clinking in the foreground. And standing right next to her was a guy who looked like he'd just stumbled out of a catalog. 20-something, grinning with that kind of effortless confidence I hadn't had since I was his age. I stared at his face, feeling every insecurity I'd ever had wrap around me like a chokehold. So this was Tyler, the funny kid, the guy who made her feel whatever she was feeling that she couldn't seem to share with me anymore. When she came back downstairs, I tried to keep calm. How was the team dinner? She froze like she'd been caught. Oh, that was just, some people from work decided to grab a bite. It was last minute, but I could see the lie in her eyes. Or maybe it was just something she wasn't saying. She used to tell me everything, no secrets, no hesitation. But now, it felt like a chasm had opened between us, one that had nothing to do with Tyler himself, and everything to do with the way she looked at him. I could see it plain as day, the spark, the excitement. And maybe the worst part was I couldn't remember the last time she looked at me that way. I convinced myself that it was all in my head, that I was being paranoid, jealous, insecure. I told myself that people have friends, that she'd always been outgoing, friendly. But some part of me, some raw, honest part, knew that this was different. Knew that whatever she shared with Tyler wasn't the kind of friendship you bring home to your spouse. A week later, I was still reeling, caught in a constant loop of second-guessing and overthinking. That's when I decided to test the waters, a casual, throwaway line, something that would tell me if I was imagining things. That Friday night, we were out at dinner. It was supposed to be a date night, just the two of us, a way to reconnect. We'd been talking about doing something like this for months, but somehow life always got in the way. Now, sitting across from her, I felt like I didn't know the person who was supposed to be my wife. Halfway through the meal, she reached for her phone, glancing down at a message with that now familiar smile, the one that never seemed to find its way to me. I took a sip of my drink, keeping my tone light. Tyler again? Her head snapped up, the smile vanishing. There was a beat of silence, thick and heavy, before she answered. No, she said quickly, too quickly. It's not Tyler. Okay, I replied, trying to mask the hurt with a forced grin. You two seem close, though. She shifted in her seat, brushing her hair behind her ear like she did when she was nervous. He's just a friend, you know? He's funny, easy to talk to. She paused, as if considering how much to share. I guess it's just nice to have someone who gets me. There it was. Those words hung between us, heavy with implications she didn't need to spell out. Someone who gets me. like I didn't anymore. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it shook as I asked, "Do I not get you anymore, Sarah?" She looked away, and her silence was louder than anything she could have said. That was the moment I realized just how far we drifted. She wasn't laughing, wasn't smiling now. She just looked sad, tired maybe, like she'd been carrying something alone for a long time and wasn't sure she could anymore. Finally, she sighed, her voice barely a whisper. We're different people now. You know that, right?" The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Different people. I couldn't deny it. We weren't the same kids we'd been back then, bright-eyed and hopelessly in love, thinking that love alone was enough to see us through anything. Life had crept in, smoothed over the rough edges of excitement, and turned us into what, exactly? Teammates? Roommates? I leaned forward, trying to make her look at me. So, what are we, Sarah? Just two people living in the same house? Because I don't want that. I don't want to be some stranger you walk past on your way out the door to meet. To meet him. She looked down, avoiding my eyes, her hands twisting in her lap. I don't know what we are, she whispered. I don't know who I am right now. Her words gutted me. We'd built a life together, shared a home, dreams, memories, a history that couldn't just be erased. And yet, here we were, both of us sitting in this fancy restaurant like actors playing a part in a play we didn't recognize anymore. After that night, things between us were strained, every conversation laced with an unspoken tension. She'd stay out later, laugh less, look away whenever our eyes met. And I was stuck in some kind of limbo, wondering if I was fighting for a marriage that was already slipping away, if I was trying to hold on to someone who had already let go. One night, I waited up for her, watching the clock tick past midnight, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to have. When she finally walked through the door, I could smell his cologne on her. Something sharp and unfamiliar, a scent that didn't belong in our home. She was flushed, her hair slightly disheveled, and when she looked at me, there was a flicker of guilt in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she murmured, but I wasn't sure if she was apologizing for the time, for the lie, or for something much deeper. And in that moment, I knew. This was more than a harmless friendship, more than some casual flirtation. It was real, and it was tearing us apart, thread by thread, moment by moment. I realized that the woman I loved, the woman I thought I'd spend my life with, had found a piece of herself that no longer belonged to me. After that night, we didn't talk about Tyler again. We didn't talk much at all, really. It was like the silence had formed a barricade between us, one we didn't dare cross. She'd leave early in the mornings, coming home later and later, slipping through the door like a ghost. I would stay up, listening to the sound of her footsteps creeping up the stairs, wondering if she knew I was awake, wondering if she even cared. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Empty almost. The laughter we used to share over weekend breakfasts, the lazy conversations on Sunday afternoons, all of it had vanished. I'd walk into the kitchen, half expecting to see her there, only to find an empty chair, her cup cold on the counter, the faintest scent of her perfume lingering as a reminder of what we'd lost. One Saturday morning, I decided I'd had enough. The silence was driving me mad, filling my head with questions I didn't have the courage to ask, answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. So, I followed her. She mentioned needing to stop by work, some excuse about a project deadline, and I pretended to buy it. But as soon as she left, I was out the door a few paces behind her, my heart pounding as if I was the one doing something wrong. She didn't go to the office. Instead, she drove across town, stopping at a quiet cafe I'd never seen before. She parked, got out, and there he was, Tyler. I hadn't seen him up close before, but I could recognize him from the photo. He looked even younger in person, with that easy smile, that relaxed way of holding himself, as if he didn't have a care in the world. And when he saw her, his face lit up in a way that confirmed everything I'd feared. She looked at him like he was the only person in the room. I felt my stomach twist, a sick feeling creeping over me. I'd imagined them together 100 times, but seeing her reach out, letting him take her hand across the table, that was something else. It felt like the ground was slipping from beneath me, like I'd been living in a reality that wasn't mine. They sat there leaning close, whispering, laughing, and I just stood outside, watching, feeling like a stranger in my own life. For a moment, I thought about walking in, demanding answers, calling her out right there in front of him, in front of everyone. But as I stared through the window, I realized something. She was happy. Happier than I'd seen her in months, maybe years. So I stayed outside, in the shadows, watching my wife share a piece of herself I hadn't seen in so long. It hurt more than I could have imagined, because somewhere deep down I knew it was over. She'd moved on, found something, someone who made her feel alive again. I drove home in a daze, replaying the scene over and over. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the nights we'd stayed up dreaming about our future, the promises we'd made to each other. And I wondered, when had it started slipping? When had I stopped being enough? The house was still when I returned. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the remnants of our life together. Photos on the fridge, little notes she'd left me over the years, trinkets from vacations, all of it suddenly feeling like artifacts of a life that no longer existed. She came home hours later, slipping through the door as quietly as always. I watched her from the kitchen as she walked upstairs without a word, her footsteps soft, as if she knew I'd been there the whole time. I waited for her to come down, to say something, anything, but the silence hung heavy between us, like the final, unspoken truth that neither of us dared to voice. I spent the night on the couch, watching the shadows stretch across the walls, wondering if this was how it all ended. Not in some grand fight, not in a whirlwind of accusations and anger, but in a quiet dissolution, a slow fading of everything we once were. And I knew then that our marriage was a memory, a flicker of what it had once been, now slipping quietly into the past. Tyler wasn't the only problem. He was a symptom, a spark that had illuminated the distance that had grown between us. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, watching the darkness, feeling the weight of an ending I hadn't seen coming. And I wondered if somehow I could find the strength to start over. The next morning, I woke up on the couch, the stale light of dawn creeping through the blinds. My back ached, and my head throbbed with the remnants of a sleepless night. But none of that hurt as much as the hollow feeling that gnawed at me, the one I couldn't shake. Sarah moved quietly around the kitchen, making coffee, her eyes cast down as though the floor held the answers we both were looking for. I thought about saying something, anything just to break the tension that seemed to press down on us, suffocating and thick. But what was there left to say? I'd seen her with him. I'd watched her laugh, touch his hand, share a version of herself that I hadn't seen in years. But the silence between us, that was the thing that hurt the most. It was like the final act of some tragic play neither of us wanted to finish, and we were both too tired to try. But even then, something in me snapped. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep avoiding what had become a daily reminder of the fracture in our lives. I looked at her, the woman I'd shared a life with, built a home with, and I just asked, "Are you in love with him?" Her hand froze on the coffee mug, her knuckles going white. She didn't look at me, didn't meet my eyes, just stared down at the counter as if it would somehow answer for her. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet I almost missed it. "I don't know." Those words cut deeper than I expected. I could feel my stomach twist, my heart tightening in my chest. "I don't know." There was no apology, no excuse, no quick reassurance to soften the blow. Just an open, aching truth. "Do you even love me anymore, Sarah?" I asked, my voice barely steady. She finally looked up, her eyes tired and sad, like she'd been carrying something for too long. "I don't know if it's that simple," she whispered. It's not just about you. It's about me. I don't know who I am anymore." Those words hung between us, both of us letting them sink in. She wasn't just talking about Tyler, I realized. She was talking about herself, her life, everything she felt she'd lost over the years. But even then, I couldn't find a way to forgive her, not after what I'd seen, not after feeling like I'd been the last one to know the woman who shared my bed. "I want to understand," I said, each word a struggle. "But you shut me out, Sarah. You chose to let someone else in. When did I stop being enough?" She pressed her lips together, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the counter. "It's not about being enough," she said, her voice breaking. "It's about feeling alive, feeling like I have something left to give, something left to feel. I didn't plan this, I didn't. She stopped, swallowing back whatever she couldn't bring herself to say. I didn't want this to happen, not like this. Her words crashed over me like a wave. It was as if she was speaking from some place I couldn't reach, some hidden corner of herself that had quietly shut the door on us. But all I could think was that she hadn't come to me, hadn't given me the chance to share in her doubts, her pain, her search for meaning. So, what now? I asked, feeling my voice crack. Are we just done? She looked away, blinking hard, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her own uncertainty was crushing her. I don't know, she repeated, voice barely a whisper. I wish I could tell you, but every time I try, I don't know. I pushed back from the table, feeling a strange mix of anger and grief, the raw ache of something breaking in real time. Maybe you should take some time to figure it out, I said, more forcefully than I intended. Maybe you need to decide if you're willing to fight for this, or if it's already over for you. She looked up, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with tears she didn't let fall. She nodded, a small, defeated gesture, and it hurt more than I wanted to admit. She turned, walked upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the cold coffee and the stinging truth. I sat there for a long time, staring at the place where she'd been, the echo of her voice lingering. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, whatever decision she made, I had to start finding my own answers too. Because if she couldn't give me the love and honesty I needed, I had to figure out if I could find it somewhere within myself. The silence settled around me, deeper now, but I felt strangely calm. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew I couldn't keep waiting, couldn't keep holding my breath, hoping for her to choose me. Not anymore. Days passed in a strange, numb quiet. Sarah and I moved around each other like strangers in our own home, two people occupying the same space but no longer part of each other's lives. She slept in the guest room most nights, and our conversations were reduced to the bare minimum, practical exchanges about groceries, bills, who'd take the car in for servicing. Each word was weighted with all the things we weren't saying, the questions I was too tired to ask anymore. One evening, I came home late after stopping by a bar alone, something I hadn't done in years. I thought it would make me feel better, give me some space to clear my head, but instead, it just made me realize how alone I felt. Even surrounded by the hum of strangers, all I could think about was the emptiness waiting for me at home. When I walked in, Sarah was sitting on the couch, legs curled up, her face softened in a way I hadn't seen in months. She looked up at me, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us sure what to say. "Can we talk?" she finally asked, her voice almost timid. I nodded, bracing myself. I didn't know if I was ready to hear what she had to say, but I was done with the silence. She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. "I know I've been distant," she said, her eyes cast down, fingers twisting in her lap. "I know I hurt you, and I know you probably hate me for it." I swallowed, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "Sarah, I need to understand. When did we get here? When did I lose you?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, her eyes filled with something close to regret. "It wasn't one thing. It wasn't even about you, really." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I got so wrapped up in being everything for everyone, a good wife, a good employee, a good friend. And somewhere along the way, I forgot who I was. I felt like I was disappearing." Her words settled over me like a weight, and I felt a pang of guilt. I'd never thought to ask her if she was happy. I'd assumed that we were both just fine, that we were in this together side by side. But now I was realizing I'd been so focused on my own comfort, my own routines, that I hadn't seen how much she was struggling, how she'd been slipping away. "Tyler," she continued, her voice trailing off. She hesitated, looking down at her hands. He saw me in a way I hadn't felt seen in a long time. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about feeling alive again, about feeling like I could be more than just this. I felt a dull ache in my chest, a mix of anger and understanding. I wanted to hate her for what she'd done, for bringing someone else into our lives, but at the same time, I felt a strange, painful empathy. She was lost, maybe just as lost as I was, and that realization cracked something open inside me. "So, what now?" I asked quietly. "What do we do with all of this?" She looked at me, her expression softening, a hint of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago flickering in her gaze. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know if we can fix this. I don't know if we're meant to." Her honesty cut deep, but it was what I needed to hear. For so long, I've been clinging to the idea that we could go back to the way things were, that somehow we'd find our way through. But now, I realized that maybe we were both holding on to something that had already fallen apart. We sat there in silence, side by side, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The space between us felt vast, like a canyon that had been slowly widening over the years, one quiet compromise after another, one unspoken feeling layered over the next. After a while, she reached out, resting her hand on mine. The gesture felt tentative, almost like a question. I looked down at our hands, at the way her fingers fit between mine, and felt a strange, bittersweet warmth. It was the first time in months that we'd touched with any kind of tenderness, any kind of care. "Maybe we just start over," she whispered. "Not like we were, but like who we are now." I looked at her, feeling the weight of her words, the possibility of rebuilding something new from the rubble of what we'd lost. It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was something, a thread of hope, a flicker of understanding. In that moment, I realized that maybe we didn't have to know all the answers. Maybe it was enough to just sit here side by side, in the quiet truth of who we'd become, and decide, slowly, if there was still something left worth saving. The weeks after that night felt strange, like we were navigating some new, uncharted territory. We decided, silently, to try again, though it wasn't anything as simple as starting over. There was too much history, too many raw places that we both danced around, careful not to reopen. But we tried, inch by inch, to let each other back in. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Sarah suggested we go through some of our old photos, something we hadn't done in years. She pulled out a dusty box from the back of the closet, and we sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sifting through our memories. As I held each picture, I felt like I was meeting an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in a long time. There was one from our first apartment, the tiny one with walls so thin we'd hear our neighbors arguing at night. There was another of us on a trip to the mountains, both of us grinning, her head on my shoulder, her cheeks pink from the cold. I realized I'd forgotten what it felt like to have her that close, to feel like she was truly mine. She picked up a picture of us on our wedding day, both of us beaming, her veil swept back by the wind. She traced a finger over the photo, a small smile playing on her lips. "We were so young," she said softly. "Yeah," I replied, watching her, feeling the distance between who we were then and who we'd become now. She looked up at me, something wistful in her eyes. "Do you ever wish we could go back?" I thought about it, really thought about it. The truth was, there had been so many moments in our past where I'd wished we could hit reset, go back to that time when things felt simpler. But now, staring at her, I realized that those days were gone, and part of me was okay with that. Maybe it was time we stopped looking backward, stopped wishing we could rewind and undo all the parts that had hurt us. "I don't know," I said finally, the words coming out slower than I meant. "Maybe we're not meant to go back. Maybe we're supposed to figure out who we are now." She nodded, a flicker of understanding in her gaze. "You're right. We've spent so long holding on to that version of us. But maybe we don't know who we are now." We sat there, both lost in our thoughts, the weight of her words settling over us. I hadn't thought much about who I was outside of being her husband. Somewhere in the mix of work, bills, routines, and daily life, I'd lost sight of the things that made me me. In the weeks that followed, we took small steps to rediscover each other. She started painting again, something she hadn't done in years, covering our spare room with canvases, paintbrushes, and sketches. I watched her as she got lost in it, that same spark in her eyes that I hadn't seen in ages, and felt a strange kind of pride. It reminded me of when I'd first fallen for her, the way she'd dive into something with her whole heart, fearless and open. Meanwhile, I started going for long drives, something I'd always loved but hadn't done in years. I'd pick a direction, put on a playlist of old songs, and just drive, letting the road take me somewhere new. Each trip was a reminder that there were parts of myself I could reclaim, even if they'd been buried for a long time. We didn't talk much about Tyler or the hurt we'd caused each other. Those wounds were still fresh, too raw to be touched. But with every day, every small gesture, we seemed to be moving closer to something, a fragile new foundation, maybe one that wasn't built on pretending, but on something real. And there were moments, little flashes, when I felt the tension between us ease, as if we were rediscovering a small piece of what had once held us together. One night, as we sat together on the back porch, watching the sky fade from dusk to darkness, she leaned her head on my shoulder, a gesture so familiar, yet unexpected that it nearly broke me. We sat there in silence, just breathing together, letting the quiet fill the spaces that had once felt like insurmountable gaps. Her hand slipped into mine, and for the first time in months, I felt the weight of her touch, warm, grounding. "We still have a long way to go," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the evening air. I squeezed her hand, feeling a tentative hope start to grow. "I know," I replied, "but I think we're getting somewhere, even if it's slow." And in that moment, I realized that maybe this was the way forward. Small steps, fragile moments, and the willingness to walk through the broken parts together. We didn't have all the answers, and maybe we never would. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were truly side by side, facing whatever would come next. Things were better. Not perfect, not even close, but we were both trying. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope between us. We weren't just two people sharing a space. We were two people sharing an effort. But even in our quiet steps forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something remained, a shadow lingering just outside the edges of our new beginning. One night, I woke up to find Sarah's side of the bed empty. It was well past midnight, and I could hear the low murmur of her voice from downstairs. I sat up, straining to hear, wondering if she was on the phone or if she was talking to him. The urge to go down, to listen, to confront whatever was left unspoken was overwhelming. But a strange sense of fear held me back. I was terrified that I'd overhear something that would undo all the tentative progress we'd made, that would snap this fragile string of hope we'd been carefully weaving. After a few minutes, the house fell silent again. I heard her footsteps as she climbed the stairs and felt the bed dip as she slid back under the covers. Her warmth close, but not touching. She settled in, her breathing evening out, leaving me staring into the darkness, my thoughts a tangle of suspicion and self-doubt. The next morning, I couldn't keep it in any longer. I waited until we'd finished breakfast, until we were both just sitting there with empty plates and too many words unsaid. "Were you on the phone last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, casual. But even to my own ears, it sounded anything but. She looked up, surprise, her eyes searching mine. "I couldn't sleep," she said quietly. I was just talking to myself, I guess. Thinking things through. Thinking about him? The question slipped out before I could stop myself. Raw and painful, hanging between us like a bruise that hadn't quite healed. She winced, looking down at her hands. "No, it wasn't about him." She hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It was about us." Her words caught me off guard. I'd prepared myself for a confession, an admission, something to reignite the hurt I'd been carrying. But this was something else. "What about us?" I asked, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. She sighed, her gaze still fixed on her hands, fingers twisting together. I wonder if we're strong enough to get through this. If we can actually build something new after everything we've broken." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, feeling the weight of her honesty press against me. It wasn't about betrayal, not this time. It was about the fear of trying and failing, of putting ourselves through this long, painful work only to discover it still wasn't enough. "I think about that too," I admitted. "Sometimes I don't know if I can handle another step, another day of trying so hard, feeling like we're barely keeping it together." She nodded, her expression softening. "I keep waiting for things to go back to the way they were, but I think that part of us might be gone." The words stung, but I knew she was right. The people we were before, the versions of ourselves that hadn't yet been scarred by mistakes, doubts, and regrets, were gone. We couldn't go back to that, not now. But maybe that's okay, I said slowly, letting the thought sink in as I spoke it. Maybe it's about accepting who we are now, and maybe that means living with some things we can't undo. She looked at me, her eyes softening with understanding. Living with the mistakes, the hurts. Yes, I said, my voice quiet but firm. But living with them together, if that's what we still want. She reached across the table, her hand covering mine, her touch tentative but warm. I want that. I want to try. It was a simple statement, but it felt like a promise. Not the kind we'd made on our wedding day, full of confidence and innocence, but something rougher, more weathered, and maybe more real. We sat there in the quiet, letting our words settle. There were still things we hadn't said, wounds that hadn't healed. There would be days when the silence returned, when the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on us. But for the first time, I felt like we had a fighting chance. And I realized that maybe love wasn't about erasing the cracks, pretending they'd never been there. Maybe it was about learning to live with them, to see beauty in the flawed, jagged edges of the life we'd pieced back together. In that small moment, surrounded by the morning light and the soft hum of hope, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. It was the little things that felt like victories. A quiet dinner without tension, a shared laugh over some old inside joke, the way she'd brush my shoulder in passing. These moments had become rare, so now I noticed every one of them. Each one felt like a small, precious step forward. But under the surface, there was a tension neither of us could ignore. It was as if we were holding our breath, unsure when the next crack would show. We'd been through enough to know that one wrong word, one unintentional reminder, could set us back to the beginning. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, she paused in front of the mirror, brushing her hair in slow, methodical strokes. She looked lost in thought, her eyes distant, as though she were somewhere else entirely. I stood by the doorway, watching her, wondering if she was thinking about the same things I was, about how far we'd come, but also how much still hung unspoken between us. "Sarah," I said, feeling the words rise before I could catch them. Are you really okay? With us, I mean?" She set the brush down and looked at me through the mirror, her expression a mix of surprise and something unreadable. She didn't answer right away, and for a moment I thought I'd pushed too far. But then she turned to face me, her arms wrapped around herself. "Some days it's hard," she admitted. "I keep asking myself if we are worth all the hurt we've been through. If we'll ever really feel whole again." Her honesty was sharp, like a blade I didn't want to face. I had wondered the same things more times than I cared to admit. But hearing her say it out loud made it all feel too real, like the delicate ground we were standing on was already beginning to crumble. "I think about that too," I confessed, stepping closer. "And I don't know if we'll ever be what we were. But I think maybe that's okay. Maybe we can still be something, even if it's different." She looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the dresser as if gathering strength. I used to believe love would be enough. But after everything, I wonder if maybe it isn't. Maybe it takes something more, something I don't know if I have left. Her voice trembled, and I could see the pain she was holding, the doubts that had taken root over the months. The truth was, love had carried us through a lot, but maybe she was right. Maybe it took more than love to carry this kind of weight, the kind of weight that lingers long after the pain has faded. "We can try to find that together," I said, reaching out, my hand resting on hers. "Whatever it takes, I want to try." She looked up at me, her eyes soft but guarded, as if she were afraid to hope. And in that moment, I understood her hesitation because I felt it too. Love had once been enough, or so I'd thought. But we were no longer those same people who believed in simple promises, who hadn't yet weathered what we had. She leaned into me then, her forehead resting against my chest, and for the first time in a long while, I felt her let down the wall she'd been holding up. Her breath was warm against me, and her arms circled around my back, pulling me closer, as if afraid I'd slip away. In that small space, with her in my arms, I realized something else. Maybe we didn't need to go back to what we were. Maybe we needed to build something new, something that could hold us as we were now, bruised, uncertain, and more than a little scarred. The doubts hadn't vanished, and the weight of what had happened still lingered. But in that moment, I felt something stronger than just hope. I felt commitment, the kind that goes beyond love, that steps into the mess and says, I'll stay anyway. Let's take it one day at a time, I whispered, my voice catching. No more pretending, no more forcing it. Just us, however we are. She nodded against me, and I could feel the faintest tremor in her breath, as if she were letting go of something too heavy to carry alone. One day at a time, she repeated softly. We stood there in the quiet, holding each other, the weight of our shared pain pressing against us, but not enough to break us. Not tonight. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, and maybe we'd never have that. But in that fragile, imperfect moment, I felt something real, something we could maybe, just maybe, hold on to. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of fragile hope and lingering doubt. Every day felt like a choice to stay, to forgive, to try again, even if it was harder than anything I'd ever done. We'd fallen into a rhythm, an unspoken pact to face each day as it came, one moment at a time. One night, as we sat together on the porch, Sarah pulled a blanket around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the stars. She looked peaceful, and I watched her in silence, afraid to break whatever quiet understanding was passing between us. Do you ever think about the future? She asked, her voice soft, like she was almost afraid of the question. The future. I hadn't dared to think that far ahead. It had been easier to focus on each day, each tentative step we took, rather than look down the long road that stretched before us. But there was something different about her tone, a flicker of something I hadn't seen in a while, a cautious hope, like she was ready to believe in the possibility of us again. I do, I said, choosing my words carefully. I think about what it would mean to start fresh, to build something that's just ours, who we are now, not who we used to be. She looked over at me, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the porch light. I want that too. I want something real. I don't want to pretend anymore. Her words hit me like a revelation. We'd spent so much time trying to fit ourselves back into a life that no longer existed, trying to force the pieces back into place. But maybe it wasn't about going back at all. Maybe it was about letting go of what we used to be and allowing ourselves the space to grow into something else. We fell into silence, and in that quiet, I felt something shift between us. A warmth, a tentative connection, like a seed finally taking root in the ashes of everything we'd lost. The next morning, Sarah surprised me. She asked if I wanted to go with her to a little art gallery in town, a place she used to love but hadn't visited in years. I'd always seen it as her thing, something she enjoyed on her own, but now there was a new openness in her invitation, a willingness to share pieces of herself that she'd once kept separate. As we walked through the gallery, she pointed out her favorite pieces, her eyes lighting up with that same spark I'd seen when we first met. I found myself smiling, captivated not by the art on the walls, but by the way she spoke, the way she seemed to come alive as she explained each piece, each color, each stroke. In that moment, I realized I was falling in love with her all over again, but not with the version of her I'd always known. This was Sarah as she was now, her dreams, her passions, her fears. And as I watched her, I felt something shift in me too, like a door opening to the possibility of a future I hadn't dared to hope for. Later, as we left the gallery, she reached for my hand, threading her fingers through mine in a way that felt easy, natural. I squeezed her hand, feeling a warmth spread through me, a kind of contentment I hadn't felt in so long. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For what? I asked, genuinely surprised. For giving me a chance to find myself again. I think somewhere along the way, I got lost, and you were still here, even when I didn't deserve it. Her words settled over me, a quiet reassurance that maybe all of this, the heartbreak, the betrayal, the nights of questioning everything, had led us to something worth fighting for. It wasn't forgiveness yet, not entirely, but it was acceptance, a small acknowledgement of the journey we'd taken to get here. As we walked back to the car, the road ahead didn't feel so daunting. There would be hard days, moments when the past would creep in, reminding us of everything we'd had to lose to reach this place. But for the first time, I felt ready to face them, knowing we were walking forward together. That night, lying in bed with her head resting on my shoulder, I closed my eyes and let myself imagine a future. Not a perfect one, but a real one, with flaws and laughter, with struggles and quiet victories. It was a vision built not on what we had been, but on who we were now, two people who had chosen against the odds to try again. I didn't know where the path would lead, but I felt something close to peace. Whatever came, I knew I could face it, so long as we faced it together.